This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 598 of the Late Round Podcast, of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. FanDuel is giving you the opportunity to get in on the action. Each week, FanDuel is offering fans the chance to win prizes by participating in daily fantasy football. The prize pool for this week's Sunday Million contest is a whopping $1.3 million, with first place taking home $250,000. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and click on the NFL Sunday Million contest. Draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy Sunday NFL football. Go to FanDuel.com today to participate in the NFL Sunday Million. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first mailbag question this week is from @FutBumbles. More of a dynasty question, but assuming Terrace Marshall is a, quote, sell low based on your study on unproductive rookies, what kind of value would you be hoping to get in return? I'm inclined to hold, but would like your thoughts on his value threshold. Thanks. So first off, I don't think he's necessarily or automatically a sell low. Like I said last week, even though a player who doesn't do that much during his rookie season is very unlikely to hit, the market matters here. If the market doesn't view Marshall very highly, then you don't have to sell, because low-cost players don't hit at high rates to begin with. Basically what I'm saying is if you trade Marshall for another player, that player is likely to have a small rate of hitting anyway. So instead of just automatically selling, you should look at the market. It's not a bad idea to check out a resource like Dynasty League Football and look at their average draft position data. They have startup ADP from November, and that ADP still has Terrace Marshall at wide receiver 41. Now, a lot's happened over the last month for Marshall, and his cost should be pushed down. But I'll tell you what, if you can get Marshall at that cost or even anywhere near that cost, I would jump on it. In this case, the market is saying that you should probably sell, because we're talking about Marshall just ahead of players like Brandon Cooks and Michael Gallup. That's according to November's ADP. If we assume that he takes a big hit, you could still get a lot of solid pieces for him. Like Van Jefferson could still potentially be in that range, or even a usable piece like Jarvis Landry if you're competitive. But players like Marshall usually have valuations all over the place. I mean, you can look at DLF's Trade Finder tool, and you can see that he recently went for Kenyon Drake and Dalton Schultz. But then he also went in a trade for Amari Cooper, which, by the way, if that's your league, you might want to look out for some collusion, because that's a dumb trade. I'll at least anecdotally tell you that 9 times out of 10, the price for these unproductive rookies is strong enough to sell. You usually should sell, but there's just such a wide range from a valuation standpoint. And as a result, you're best off just sending offers based on his startup ADP and then going from there. This next question is from @Mr. Davey Ross. In the playoffs, do you adapt to more of a DFS mindset given the need to win? For example, going with boom or bust players over someone perceived as safe, or playing a defense that is matched up against your opponent's quarterback, etc. Look, guys, don't overthink it. I got this type of question a couple of times this week, and I think that you're overthinking it. You're not playing a GPP in your fantasy league. It's still a head-to-head in 99% of cases. Going with just a ton of variance in your lineup, that's not necessary unless you're objectively a big underdog and you need to take that on. But that's the same answer that I would give you in the regular season too, because the game is the same. It didn't change because it's week 15. You're still playing against an opponent, and you should treat the matchup the same way. If you're looking good, you can play it safer. If you're not, embrace more variance. This next question is from @TLNAFed. Can you talk about the Jerry Jeudy hype? Most of us felt bullish about him in the offseason. Actually, he is indeed the best wide receiver in Denver when he's healthy, but the output is not what we expected. What's wrong with it? The quarterback issue, or does the team just want to be run heavy? Thanks. So as someone who was into Jerry Jeudy this year, and as someone who has Jeudy on a lot of rosters, the situation does indeed suck. There are a handful of reasons for his lack of production this year. First and foremost, the obvious one is touchdowns. He hasn't scored in 7 games played. That's going to hurt output. So is the fact that his target share per game rate is 21.2% in an offense that ranks 20th in pass rate. And it's an offense that's below the league average in overall pass attempts. And Jeudy's not seeing very many targets down the field. He has 8 15-plus air yard targets this year. That's in 7 games. For For some comparison, Cortland Sutton has 25 in 13 games. Jeudy ranks in the 19th percentile on average depth of target among 40-plus target wide receivers this year. So there's just a lot that's worked against him across the board. Those things are just sort of piling on top of one another. I still like Jeudy long term, but it's tough to get on board for the fantasy playoffs. This next question is from @ShyBears530. Now that Hopkins is out for the regular season, is AJ Green a good add? Christian Kirk? So I know I talked about these two on yesterday's Sleepers episode, but I wanted to talk more about this on today's show because I got a lot of questions about it. The splits that the Cardinals have with and without DeAndre Hopkins, they're a little bit wonky because Kyler Murray was also sidelined with DeAndre Hopkins this year. But what we can at least look at is the general usage data like routes run to see how things changed for Green and Kirk without Hopkins. Hopkins missed weeks 9, 10, and 11 this year. Christian Kirk has played every game, and AJ Green missed one of those games without Hopkins. So let's look at the usage in weeks 10 and 11 versus the rest of the season, and I'll remove week 9 totally because Kirk played without both wide receivers. In weeks 10 and 11, according to Pro Football Focus, Kirk ran the most routes on the team. In every week outside of weeks 10 and 11 and week 9, AJ Green has led Kirk in routes run. Now, maybe some of that was injury related for AJ Green, but I think at the very least, we can feel confident that Kirk is going to be a full-time player in this Arizona offense without DeAndre Hopkins. That makes sense. That naturally means that he gets a bigger bump in playing time than AJ Green will, because Green was already running more routes. Now, what's not surprising is that Kirk played a lot less in the slot without DeAndre Hopkins and without Green for that one game. Kirk has played 86% of his snaps from the slot outside of those games, but his slot snap rate in those games was 56%. So Kirk is going to get a slightly different role with this, and that brings more ambiguity. I'm a fan of the talent of Christian Kirk. I think he's good, and I think that he does bring more upside than AJ Green. But like I said on yesterday's show, both players should be rostered. Kirk just probably gets more of an uptick from his baseline. This next question is from @BGTEvan. Do you think ranking defensive opponents as first against, second against, etc. is a suboptimal way to show matchup strength because the gaps aren't all equal? And would it be better if we simply stated how a defense statistically compares to league average? Yeah, it's suboptimal. Just like player rankings are suboptimal. Rankings are linear. Players don't score fantasy points in that fashion. And to be clear, any sort of rank against a position is formulated by a number, some number. I've talked about this on the 10 Trend Show. I talked about that earlier this week on the 10 Trend Show. I mentioned how the Vikings have played about 8 points below expectation per game versus team wide receivers. The reason analysts like myself will reference a ranking is because it gives you better context and it's quick and easy to talk about. But make no mistake, I'm not citing that ranking without a backbone. It's based on mathematical evidence and actual numbers. This next question is from @PJHen77. Hi, JJ. I understand the state of the running back position, but is there a reason to still roster a player like Tony Pollard through the playoffs? He can't get himself on the field. His injury sounds worse than the Cowboys are letting on. He feels like a wasted bench spot. I think Tony Pollard needs to be rostered in every single league right now. Just because his injury might be worse than what the Cowboys are saying doesn't mean that it is. It doesn't mean that it will be. You can't make your fantasy decisions based on that kind of feel. And very few players have the upside that Pollard has. We're very much in handcuff season. And Pollard is a high-end handcuff in a good offense. At the end of the season, when it's all said and done, he may not be usable, but from a process standpoint, he needs to be rostered. This next question is from @Isra_25. Part of a 10-team league with 6 playoff spots. I missed the playoffs, but was 5th in scoring, victim of bad matchups. How do I convince my cavemen league mates to leave the last playoff spot for most points not in the top 5? I still haven't convinced them about dropping kickers. Honestly, you explain to them that you don't play defense in fantasy football. It's not real football. You're not stopping your opponent from scoring points in a given week by doing something special. So there's naturally some luck involved with whatever schedule you get. You can only control your team. So there should be a reward for teams that did that well. There are a lot of ways to do that, and there are a lot of ways to remove matchup luck. But if people can't understand that you're not playing defense in fantasy football, it's going to be tough to change their minds. This last question, it's going to be a long answer, but I think it's worth it. It's from @James_AG1. Do you have any data in regards to what general drafting strategy performed the best this year? It feels like it doesn't really matter what strategy you implemented. You just had to have the right players as always. So since the start of fantasy analysis, people have been saying, oh, strategy doesn't matter. You just have to pick the right players and you'll be fine. Okay, well, how do you pick the right players? Because if you think that it's just 100% luck, then you're going to have a hard time winning in fantasy football year after year. Strategy is there to help increase your probability of hitting on the right players. Like, yes, it's possible to just go into your draft and just pick off guys one by one without any real plan. And maybe Frank from accounting, who knows very little about fantasy football strategy, walked away with Jonathan Taylor and Cooper Kupp and Deebo Samuel and Leonard Fournette this year. And he's set to win a championship. Strategy can help lead you to those players, though, even if it's by process of elimination. Let me give you an example. The running back dead zone. All offseason, analysts, myself included, talked about avoiding running backs in the dead zone. My analysis showed me that running backs in that range, in the round 4 and 5 range especially, that running backs typically don't hit at a high rate in that range. Historical average draft position data shows that. And it shows that league winners at running back are coming from round 6, 7, and 8 at a very similar rate. Meanwhile, in that range, wide receivers hit at a pretty good rate. And wide receivers are sort of the alternative to not drafting a running back. If we're saying don't get this running back, then that means you're almost definitely going to get a wide receiver instead. That's just how fantasy football is structured. Even if you had no favorite wide receivers in that round 4 and 5 range, had you followed the strategy of avoiding the running back dead zone, then you increased your chances of getting arguably the single best fantasy football asset this year in Cooper Kupp. And if you avoided running backs in that range while then targeting running backs just a little bit later, you increased your chances of hitting another huge value in Leonard Fournette. Fantasy football strategy is not just about pinpointing the player to target. This is what I try to preach all offseason. It's just as much about knowing which players to not target, whether that's based on their individual profile or what historical data has taught us. I can speak to this on a very individual level too. I generally know how my season went as an analyst based on how my own teams performed. And this season, it was one where I made the playoffs at one of the highest rates in my fantasy football career. But my teams didn't necessarily dominate. Like, I have a couple of really awesome teams, but most of my teams are 3, 4, or 5 seeds in the playoffs. And I think it's because I did a great job this year of pinpointing the players to not get in your draft. But I wasn't out there pounding my chest saying, get Cooper Kupp or absolutely get Deebo Samuel. I have Jonathan Taylor in some leagues. I got Cooper Kupp in some leagues. I've got Leonard Fournette in some leagues. But they weren't my highest rostered players or anything. What I was able to do, though, is take all of the strategic information that I spoke about over the offseason and use that to know when to not get players. I have 0 Allen Robinson this year. I was lower than the consensus on Robinson. Why? Because of that study I did on mobile quarterbacks and how they impact their pass catchers. I have barely any Noah Fant and Tyler Higbee. Why? Because I did a study on finding breakout tight ends that showed that those types of tight ends, the ones who were drafted in the middle rounds with a teammate drafted ahead of them, those aren't the tight ends to target. Instead, you should look for tight ends late who are associated with top 5 quarterbacks by ADP, like Buffalo and Dallas. And naturally, I've got a ton of Dawson Knox, and I have a ton of Dalton Schultz once we saw that things were trending in his direction and away from Blake Jarwin. I have Elijah Mitchell in a ton of spots. He's probably my highest rostered player this year. Why? Because I recognize that breakout running backs come from ambiguous backfields. And when Trey Sermon was inactive in week 1 before that game, I added Elijah Mitchell everywhere. And I even talked about doing that on my Start Sit live stream that Sunday morning. I've got receipts. This isn't some hindsight, look at me, I did so many good things BS. You guys know that's not what I do on this show. That's not how I go about things. I did a lot of bad things this year too. I'm simply pointing out that what led me to so many of these players this year wasn't simply player analysis. It was strategy. It's really easy to look at the end result in fantasy football and just see a list of names. And yes, luck is going to play a factor. Getting Christian McCaffrey ruined your season. Getting Calvin Ridley really hurt your season too. But that doesn't mean that we just throw our arms up and say fantasy football is all luck. You just have to pick the right guys and anyone can do that. And James, I'm not saying that's what you're doing here. I'm just pointing out that there's so much more detail to this than player analysis. There's a process, and that process is undoubtedly going to help raise your probability of winning year in and year out. It may seem like people are just getting lucky, and some people are in random seasons, but strategy is how we shift our chances of finding these league-winning players. Strategy is your backbone in fantasy football, not player analysis. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend. Good luck in the fantasy playoffs. I'll talk to you next week.